Hi, I'm Lee Thornton and you join me today at Alvechurch Fishery in Worcestershire, where I'm going to be giving you my 5 top tips for catching fish during the winter months. Okay, so my first tip is to understand exactly how the fish behave in this time of year and base your whole approach around increasing the probability of getting fish to come in your peg. So when carp and F1s and any fish in winter, their metabolism is very slow, they're not likely to feed, and they're likely to back off into areas where they're going to feel safe from anglers. So I base my entire approach around that, i.e. I don't want to be putting my pole across the water because I think the flash of the pole across can potentially move fish. I want to be keeping plumbing to a minimum. We'll get onto that in my second tip where I'd start. I want to get my kit set up really quickly and then away from my peg to stop any disturbance, etc. These fish are likely to back off, and yeah, everything that you do wants to be stealthy and wants to increase the probability of fish ending up in your swim so you can catch them. Okay, so in keeping with tip number 1, tip number 2 is to make sure that again you're keeping disturbance to a minimum. Generally speaking, you sort of know where the fish are going to sit during the winter. They sit far away from the angler. On snake lakes, you're talking 3/4 of the way across to the far bank. On open waters like this, you know there's probably not going to be any fish sat short at the start when you're looking to start your session. So the reason I start there is twofold really. Is one, you're not plumbing up over the top of where you think the fish are going to be and pushing them out the peg, but 2, you're allowing other anglers around you to make mistakes potentially and plunder the fish too soon and create a bit of a safe space in front of you that once they've hooked their first fish, their second fish, that shoal could end up in front of me. So again, it's keeping into with the theme that the fish are going to back off from anglers when they get caught and creating myself a safe space for fish to start. So yeah, basically all I'm going to do is start about 5 or 6 sections where I'm confident that fish aren't naturally going to congregate in the colder water, and I'm going to feed a tight little group of bait and then just sit there nice and patiently and make sure that I'm not the first angler to go across and start fishing. So that's tip number 2. I have a little half tip for you, we'll call it 2.5, is something that I learnt years ago, is when you're plumbing your float up or shotting your float up, sorry, make sure you've always got a plummet on. Now the reason for this is quite often in winter, and I've done it quite a few times myself, it is possible to lay your rig over fish that are sort of in the water column when you're trying to get your float shotted right and accidentally foul hook one. And trust me, this is the worst thing you ever do. If you foul hook one before the start of the match, I can guarantee 9 times out of 10 you'll have a really bad day, because it tends to be when you push the fish out of your peg and yeah, you're the first one to spook them. So obviously you can see by making sure that the hook is in a plummet, you will never ever hook a fish as you're shotting up your float, and it's something that I've done for years and years. I will not shot a float up without having a plummet on, basically. Okay, so tip number 3. We've started short. On this occasion we've not had a bite, but that's fine. The fish have sort of congregated into the area of my peg, so now I'm going to go out. I'm going to always start this time of year with single hook baits. For me, bait is the number 1 thing that spooks fish more than actually catching them. So by that I mean, if you introduce bait at the wrong time in the winter and the fish isn't ready to feed, it will actually spook and move away from that area that you've fed. So you want to be encouraging the fish to stay in your swim. So I'm going to go out with a single hook bait. I've not plumbed up. I don't know the depth out there. For me, that's more important than plumbing up and making sure you're 6 inches off bottom, is to go out into an area of your swim that you've not disturbed whatsoever. You're going to increase your chances of getting a bite. What depth to go at would be a question that lots of you will ask. For me, commercials, carp, F1s, the magic depth that's worked for me for years on every venue is always 3 foot. I think in the cold water, even during the warmer months, a lot of the time the fish will naturally sit in and around 3 foot where they're comfortable in the water column. So when it comes to dobbing, what I want to do is, knowing that they're going to be in and around that 3 foot, I always want the hook bait to be slightly above the fish, so they're looking up at your target hook bait when they come in and suck it in. If you drop it in deeper than that 3 foot, you're going to increase your chances of foul hooking, because the fish A, aren't going to be able to see it because they don't look down very effectively, but B, your hook is going to be underneath where the fish are sat, and you're likely to get liners and foul hook a fish and then spook them out your peg before you've had a chance to catch one. So yeah, I'm going to go out probably 4 or 5 inches shallower than 3 foot in an area of my peg that I've seen a couple of fish, there's been a bit of fizzing, and that's where I'm going to start. So in terms of the actual rig itself and the top kit, again, keeping in with the stealthy approach, I've got one of the new power light kits in Ghost. That's perfect for this time of year. It makes sure that it's sort of like disguised against the grey sort of background that you get during the winter, and keeps with the stealthy approach. I've got a really long line between elastic and float. That's to keep the pole tip again further away from the fish. It's been noticeable even today that we've seen a couple of fish, as soon as you go out, they back straight off the pole tip. So everything that you can do at this stage is to keep everything as stealthy as possible. You need to employ to get bites at this time of year. So in terms of the hook bait, I'm just going to go in with a 7mm punch. For me, that's always been one of the more reliable size bit of bread punch. And yeah, I'm going to go straight into my area of my swim that I think the fish are going to be sitting. There we go. We haven't fed out there. We've dropped into an area of my peg where I thought the fish were going to be. I've missed an indication on the settle, but then I've dropped back in and I've hooked one within a minute. And that's exactly what winter fishing is all about, is resting your areas of your peg, dropping in, taking advantage of a quick bite off a big fish. And now the best thing for me to do would be to not drop in on that area of my peg for a good 15-20 minutes to make sure that I'm not spooking them, and I've raised my chances of getting another bite when I drop back into that area again. It's never a rush in winter, and when you're talking about sort of like 4, 5, 6 pound fish, you don't need many of those to catch the sort of 40, 50 pound that are generally sort of can be a winning winter weight. So patience is the virtue, really. Go. Lovely mirror. Hold him up for you. And they're the sort of size fish that you can catch employing this method. Well, I really enjoyed that, so let's go and try and catch another. So I am going straight in after catching that fish, but what I'm going to do is I'm not going to drop in on the exact location where I caught that fish from. I'm going to find another area of my peg, just because although you're not feeding any bait, you can still rest your swims when it comes to dobbing. And quite often, if you know where the fish are, if you spend 10 minutes fishing that spot, but the fish are unsettled, you won't get a bite. Whereas if you spent 10 minutes fishing somewhere else, even if you know you're not going to catch, the confidence in those fish is raised to the point where, again, you're raising your probability of dropping in and actually getting a fish suck your bait in. So resting your swim, even though you're not feeding anything, is actually really important. So yeah, I'm a good 2 or 3 meters away from where I hooked that last fish. And it's important just to keep an eye on what's happening in the water as well. Although you might not see fish, like tiny little bubbles and stuff like that can give away where the location of the fish are, just to put everything in your favour of what of where next to fish, if you know what I mean. Always keep an eye on what's happening in your swim. The little tiniest clues can often help you. In terms of how long I'd sit and wait, I always think you're going to get your indication within 30 seconds to a minute. So yeah, if you're searching your peg along, you know, I would wait at least a minute, maybe a minute and a half sometimes before you try another location or relay your rigging. It seems very counterproductive sometimes to have your rig sat there for such a long time with a bait suspended, but quite often, yeah, it does take that 30 seconds to a minute for a fish to actually, you know, eat your bait. So just be patient. There you go. There you go. We just dropped into another spot, and that took it fairly quickly, about 15 seconds after it settled. Again, this is a different spot to where I just caught that fish a few minutes ago. So I've actually got a bit of an area or two areas now that I can hopefully drop between and catch a few fish. Again, just take your time at this time of year. There's no rush in any way, shape or form. It's very rare that you're fishing for a big weight. Incidentally, I've got 014 on. It seems quite heavy for winter, but with single hook bait fishing when they're looking up, I don't think line diameter makes as big a difference as if you're fishing on the bottom. i.e. they're not going to be, you know, yeah, they're coming from underneath, so they're not brushing into your rig at all. The line's not in their eyesight, so you can quite often get away with heavier line than what you think you'd need in winter when you're dobbing, basically. So now I've returned that fish, I just want to talk about another tip for you for winter dobbing, basically. So the most important thing for getting bites with single hook baits is getting the correct depth. So it becomes even more important with F1 fishing. So basically, if you ever miss a bite, in my opinion, you're fishing too deep, and it could be the difference between 1 inch or 2 inches that will make the difference between converting those missed bites to bites. I honestly think they just sat in the wrong depth, and you always want to have the hook bait just slightly above in the eye line, so they turn upwards and suck your bait in. And to help with understanding what depth to fish at, I tend to fish with a little bit more shot down the line to sort of try and read what's going on in the peg. It used to be really popular to have like all of the weight of the rig directly beneath the float and have like loose line, but in my opinion that doesn't allow you to read your peg efficiently enough to understand what depth you're going to be fishing at. So yeah, for me, having a bit of shot down the line, so there's a bit more tension so you can see those line bites, and then making sure that you're doing those micro adjustments. Like I said, with big carp it's less important. When you start getting to dobbing with F1s, they're a lot more finicky, and honestly, two inches, 1 inch can make the difference between a few missed bites and putting some fish in the net. So that's my tip 3.5. Okay, so on to tip number 4. So you've caught a few fish dobbing, or you may not have caught a few fish dobbing, and by dobbing I'm talking about single hook bait, mainly bred, off the bottom. So another form of dobbing, which isn't really seen as dobbing but is in my mind, is something else that can be employed at this time, i.e. if you haven't had any bites by suspending a hook bait above the shoal of fish, the next thing for me to go to would be to tap in small amounts of bait, i.e. 1 or 2 particles at a time, and keep laying my rigging, because although you're feeding a minuscule amount to try and force a fish to get the attention of the attraction of bait falling through the water, follow it to the bottom and pick up your hook bait. I still see that personally as dobbing, because the amount of bait that you're putting in is minuscule. You're talking 1, 2, 3 maggots at a time, and then you keep laying your rigging. So that's what we're going to go to next. I've just plumbed up at 16 metres where I've caught a few of the breadfish. Rig just touching the bottom, and we're going to tap in a few bits of bait, keep laying the rig in, and hope one of those fish just follow it down to the bottom and pick it up. And quite often, I would say this will work more for F1s than what it will carp in my experience. There's always something I used to fish a lot at Tunnel Barn Farm, is find 3 foot of depth, tap in 1 or 2 maggots, catch a few fish, and then you'd have to re-plumb up again and follow those fish as they back off down your peg. But yeah, we're going to give it a go for the carp here, because it's another form of dobbing, and it's my tip number 4. So all we're going to do, we're going to take off the pot that I've been using just to sprinkle in maggots, put one with a bigger lid in it, and then going to look to feed a decent amount of bait, probably 15 to 20 maggots, and we're going to try and get them fish to go down and actually start feeding. I've just re-plumbed up a new spot, hit a couple of fish with the plummet, which again is another top tip in winter, is that if you're really struggling to find the fish, quite often a plummet and moving it around your peg, you'll bump into the shoal of fish where they are, and yeah, that can be a really helpful way to find the fish. So I know exactly where I'm going into now has got some fish on it, so I've just located them, and yeah, we're going to feed 20-30 maggots and try and get a bite on the bottom to finish the session with. So right, while I'm out here going through tip number 4, we can move on to tip number 5. So there comes a point in the match or a session during the winter where the fish may or may not have a feed right at the very end of the match, or as the sun's going down, etc, etc. So I will avoid as much as possible on commercial fisheries feeding bait for as long as possible, because like I said, in my opinion, 90% of the fish aren't feeding in your swim, and you're likely to push them out of your peg if you're the one feeding first. So what my advice is, always leave it until as long as humanly possible to start introducing bait into your peg. So quite often that could even be in the last 45 minutes, last half hour even. Don't put anything in until you think the fish are ready to have a feed. And then, yeah, we're simply going to use this rig that I'm currently, laying in with small amounts of bait, but put in a larger volume to hopefully start taking advantage of them feeding fish late on in the day. Okay, so there's my top 5 winter tips to help you with your winter fishing. So today, the standout standout method that's quite clearly the best today is a single bit of bread off the bottom. So we're talking 2 foot off the bottom. To finish the session off, I'm going to go back out, so I've enjoyed catching these fish, fishing in that manner, and hopefully get a couple of big carp to finish the session with, really. But yeah, if you follow those tips, make sure that stealth and patience are your main approaches to your sessions this time of year, and always go through that cycle. Like I said, it's been clear to me today that bread's been the best, but if you go on the bottom and feed too early and foul hook fish because they're not prepared to go down and feed, that could be the worst thing possible that you can possibly do in the winter. So I think it's always best to go through that sort of cycle that I've run through today. Start off short, get some fish, gather into your peg, use your single hook baits by fishing off the bottom, always slightly above the fish's eye line if you can work out what depth they're sitting at, and then leave it as late as possible before you start introducing bait. And yeah, I can guarantee you'll get the best out of your winter sessions following those tips.